Hello, and welcome to the Europe at War podcast.
Episode 3.12, the 30th of April. By the 30th of April, German control in the centre of Berlin had shrunk to the area between the Reichstag, the Friedrichstraße Bahnhof, the Gendarmenmarkt, the Air Ministry, and the Reich Chancellery. These buildings were little more than 1 kilometre apart from one another, and within this pocket, 10,000 Berlin garrison troops were still holding out. Some troops, like the foreign SS volunteers and the Hitler Youth units, were eager to make a last stand. But most of the remaining Berlin garrison forces, in particular the shattered remnants of Volkssturm, Police, and Wehrmacht units, were just hoping for the nightmare to end. All units were desperately short on men and ammo, with even the most fanatical groups, such as the French SS Charlemagne contingent, so severely depleted that they could count less than 30 fighting men within their ranks, all of whom possessed little more than a handful of Panzerfausts between them. The Berlin garrison also only had a few tanks left, most of which were concentrated in the Tiergarten Park, hoping to hold back the wave of Soviet troops poised to attack the Reichstag. Berlin's defenders also had no idea what was to become of them. Were they really just going to fight and die on the steps of the Reichstag? Or might they possibly be allowed to attempt a breakout in order to give them some chance of surviving this madness? Until they received orders, all they could do was continue to launch their Panzerfausts, throw their grenades, and fire their last remaining rounds at the hordes of Russians advancing upon them from all directions. Knowing it was going to be his last day on Earth, Hitler had a restless night, and he woke earlier than usual. But any hope that the new day might bring about a change in the fortunes of Berlin was quickly dispelled when the message came through to the Führerbunker that Wenck's counterattack towards the capital had failed. At 6 a.m., Hitler summoned SS Brigadeführer Mohnke, and he asked him for an update on the Soviet advance in the center of Berlin. Mohnke replied that the Russians had reached the Hotel Adlon, and that they had also infiltrated the U-Bahn tunnels under Friedrichstraße and Vossstraße, which therefore placed the Soviets within spitting distance of the Reich Chancellery. Mohnke added that his troops were on the brink of collapse, and that the Soviets would surely soon launch an all-out attack on the remaining buildings under German control, such as the Reichstag. To compound the bad news, a few hours later, during Hitler's final morning briefing, General Krebs confirmed the hopelessness of the Berlin garrison's position, reporting that the Russians had captured the Anhalter Bahnhof and now controlled Leipziger Straße. This put the Red Army within just a few hundred meters of the Führerbunker, though the Soviets still didn't know about the existence of the bunker itself. In any case, Hitler just sat there, passively absorbing everything. And for once in his life, he seems not to have tried to interrupt or spin out a new hysterical fantasy about some last-minute counterattack which would save them all. No, Hitler knew that this was the end of the Third Reich. And he also knew that this was the end for him. And in an uncharacteristic moment of sanity, Hitler now sent a letter to General Weidling, which read, "In the event that there should be a shortage of ammunition or supplies in the Reich capital, I hereby give my permission for our troops to attempt a breakout. This operation should be organized in combat teams as small as possible. every effort should be made to link up with German units still carrying on the fight outside the city of Berlin. If such cannot be located, the Berlin forces must take to the woods and continue resistance from there. With Hitler's approval for a breakout finally in his hands, Weidling wasted no time in convening a conference of the remaining defense sector commanders. He informed them that a breakout from Berlin had been authorized by Hitler, and he instructed them to start preparations at once. If all went well, the plan was to launch a breakout attempt at 10 p.m. that same night. The Soviets, of course, understood full well that the most likely escape route for the Berlin garrison forces would be through Western Berlin, and such was their fear that Hitler and other senior Nazis might successfully escape the city, the Red Army redoubled their efforts to close off this potential escape route by strengthening their hold on the Charlottenburg and Wilmersdorf districts. As a result, a rare example of Red Army inter-front unity was forged when the 1st Ukrainian Front's 3rd Guards Tank Army worked hand in hand with the 1st Belarusian Front's 2nd Guards Tank Army to root out the disparate groups of German units trying desperately to force open an escape corridor in these areas. And particularly fierce fighting was reported in the area between Berliner Straße, which is now known as Otto-Suhr-Allee, and Kantstraße. Meanwhile, the Soviets also ramped up the pressure on the western edge of the German-held territory in the center of Berlin by launching a renewed assault on the remaining German garrison troops stationed to the west of Tiergarten. And these German troops were centered around the imposing Zoo Flak Tower. This Soviet assault was launched by General Katukov's 1st Guards Tank Army and General Chuikov's 8th Guards Army, and the specific task of bottling up the Zoo Flak Tower was assigned to 2 regiments from the 79th Guards Rifle Division from Chuikov's 8th Guards Army. However, despite the overwhelming amount of Soviet troops and guns assigned to the task of taking the tower, once again, the thick concrete walls proved impervious to even the heaviest of Soviet guns, rendering a direct assault on the tower impossible. Therefore, captured German prisoners were sent forward as peace envoys, demanding the surrender of the garrison troops holding out inside the Flak Tower. In a sign of just how unwilling the Soviets were to assault the tower, they were willing to promise anything if the tower's inhabitants gave up. And they even went as far as to promise the people inside the Flak Tower that no one, including SS troops, would be executed if they surrendered. The garrison forces inside the tower diplomatically replied that they would respond to the Soviet offer of surrender the next day. Given the Soviet tendency for revenge, the Germans inside the tower were understandably cautious about surrendering. That said, keeping the Flak Tower in German hands for as long as possible was vital to the Berlin garrison's hopes of staging a successful breakout, as the Zoo Flak Tower's impressive guns could be used to provide artillery fire for any breakout groups. But of course, the main focus for the Soviets, and for Stalin, was the assault on the Reichstag, which was being led by the 79th Rifle Corps of the 3rd Shock Army. Just a quick heads up to say that in the description for today's episode, I've once again posted a link to a map outlining the Soviet assault on the Reichstag. That map should really help you to visualize the events covered in the rest of today's episode. In the early hours of the 30th of April, the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions finished clearing out German troops from the western half of the diplomatic quarter. And once the final German stragglers were mopped up, the Rifle Divisions were ready to continue their attack towards the Reichstag. both divisions had suffered incredibly high losses in the crossing of the Moltke Bridge and the subsequent house-to-house fighting in the diplomatic quarter. So the logical, perhaps humane thing to do would be to have given both divisions some time to rest and replenish their frontline troops. But this is the Red Army we're talking about, so in reality, the Russians waited only half an hour before launching the next phase of their assault on the Reichstag. It's hard to imagine the pressure the frontline Soviet infantry were under. In front of them lay multiple defense lines manned by fanatical German soldiers, whilst behind them they had equally fanatical political commissars and hardline senior officers using thinly veiled threats to motivate the infantry into launching near-suicidal attacks. The war was about to end. Everybody could see that now, but Stalin and his senior commanders had a deadline. Remember, the Reichstag must be taken by the 1st of May. And it didn't matter how many soldiers it took to get it done. However, in recognition of the losses the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions had suffered, the 79th Rifle Corps also committed the 207th Rifle Division to assist in the next phase of the assault. Before the Soviets could reach the Reichstag, however, they first had to overcome the German defences positioned in the Kroll Opera House, which stood on Königsplatz, today known as the Platz der Republik. The Opera House had been used by the Nazis to host sessions of the Reichstag Parliament, since the main Reichstag building itself had been burnt down in the notorious fire of February 1933. In April 1945, however, the Germans had turned the building into another formidable defensive position, crawling with machine gun nests and adorned with heavy guns. Thus, the building represented one of the last major obstacles for the Soviets to get through before they could assault the Reichstag. To even reach the Opera House, however, the Soviets first had to make their way through a series of heavily defended buildings along the Schlieffenufer, which is today known as John Foster Dulles Alley. And once the Opera House was taken, the Soviet troops would then have to cross a water-filled trench running right through the middle of the Königsplatz. This waterway had been formed when an U-Bahn tunnel had collapsed and water from the River Spree had come flowing in. At 6 a.m., the Soviets began their assault by sending in waves of infantry towards the buildings along the Schlieffenufer. But because these riflemen had to advance across open ground, they were quickly cut to pieces by German machine guns. Realizing the futility of relying on infantry alone, the Soviets brought tanks, heavy guns, and rocket launchers across the Moltke Bridge to provide an urgently needed extra punch to the attack. And some of these guns were positioned in the upper floors and on the roof of the newly captured Prussian Ministry of the Interior, whilst the tanks and rocket launchers were placed in the grounds outside. Once these guns were in place, they unleashed a hail of fire onto the German positions, which was far more accurate than the Soviet long-range artillery efforts had been. Once the bombardment was over, the Soviet infantry was sent in again after 11 a.m. to resume their attack on the buildings, but this time with greater success. After intense fighting, the Soviet troops managed to advance through the network of buildings along the Schlieffenufer. And after regiments from the 207th Rifle Division cleared out the remaining German troops in the Opera House, the 150th and 171st Rifle Divisions were free to continue with their assault on the Reichstag. At 1 p.m., another monstrous artillery barrage was launched by the Soviets. And once the shelling stopped, officers blew their whistles and hordes of Red Army infantry charged towards the Reichstag. But as soon as the infantry rushed forward, they were immediately hit by a wave of German artillery fire which came from the flak tower at Zoo, and swathes of Soviet infantry were cut down in an instant. The 171st Rifle Division pushed forward on the left flank, clearing out the eastern half of the diplomatic quarter, and they successfully secured the Kronprinzen Bridge, which was behind the Reichstag. In securing the bridge, the Rifle Division could prevent any German counterattacks which might have threatened the Soviet advance onto the Reichstag. Moreover, by now maneuvering behind the Reichstag itself, the division was able to bring their self-propelled guns into position and start raining flanking fire down upon the rear of the German troops defending the front steps of the Reichstag. After 4 long years of bloody war and the sacrifice of millions of men and women, the Red Army was now only 200 meters from the steps of the Reichstag. But getting across those final 200 meters would be far from simple. Here, the Germans had set up a deadly series of trenches, barbed wire, mines, and machine gun nests, complemented by heavy guns. Such was the deadly concentration of fortifications, combined with the continuing threat of artillery fire from the Zoo Flak Tower, the Soviets decided to wait for the cover of darkness before launching the next attack. So, at 6 p.m., just as the light began to fade, it was time for the Red Army to assault the Reichstag. Striding forth in an almost banzai-like attack, a tidal wave of Soviet riflemen from the 150th Rifle Division hurled themselves at the few hundred German troops who were left guarding the entrance to the building. Soviet tank shells ripped through the mines and the barbed wire. German soldiers were blasted apart by the incoming artillery fire. Shrapnel flew through the air, and a murderous wave of hand-to-hand fighting turned the trenches into a bloodbath. The losses were unimaginable, but for every fallen Soviet soldier, it seemed 10 more were ready to fill his place. And so, inevitably, the constant pressure and influx of Soviet troops proved to be too much for the rapidly diminishing German defenders. There was only ever going to be one outcome. Soon, the first Soviet riflemen had reached the front steps of the Reichstag, and upon finding that the front doors had been bricked up, they fired mortars at them horizontally, blasting a hole which the vanguard then poured into. The lead troops burst into the building and were instantly met with a ferocious volley of German machine gun fire, which rained down upon them from elevated positions at the top of the stairs and from the balconies above. What followed was a brutal and ferocious battle in which German and Soviet troops traded machine gun fire, grenades, and Panzerfaust fire as both sides fought with an animalistic fury. Because the building had been bricked up and abandoned for so many years, most of the interior was dark, dusty, and full of debris. This meant that often the only source of light the soldiers had were the muzzle flashes and explosions erupting around them. Soon, the exploding grenades and Panzerfaust rockets caused fires to break out in the building, sending thick plumes of smoke throughout the rooms and corridors, choking both the attackers and defenders. The remaining German troops inside the building were a mixture of Waffen-SS diehards, foreign volunteers, Hitler Youth, and out-of-their-depth Kriegsmarine personnel. They fought bitterly, but there were simply too few of them to seriously have any chance of holding back the Russians for long. Within a few hours, half of the defenders had been forced down into the basement of the building, whilst the other half had retreated to the upper floors, trading fire with the Soviets every step of the way. Soon, the Soviet riflemen had fought their way onto the second floor, where they established telephone communications with regimental headquarters. These first Soviet soldiers to enter the building had carried their regimental and battalion standards with them, aiming to raise them on the roof once they had captured the building. But when HQ heard that the infantry had already reached the second floor, a specially designated group of Commissar and Communist Party members were hastily dispatched to the Reichstag so that they could raise a large, pristine, and immaculate Soviet Union flag called Red Banner No. 5 on the roof instead. As a final political flair, a Georgian was included in the special flag-raising group, in homage to Stalin himself. But the Reichstag had to be fully taken first before any flag could be raised on the roof. With the fighting raging all around them, 2 men from the special banner group made a break for the roof to raise the flag. But German defending troops pinned them down with machine gun fire on the second floor. Shortly before 11 p.m, a second attempt was made to reach the roof and raise the flag, and it is claimed that this attempt was indeed successful. However, we should take this story with a huge pinch of salt, as it probably just reflects the official Soviet propaganda line that the building must be captured before the 1st of May. The truth is, it's difficult to pin down the exact moment of when the red flag was raised over the Reichstag, because there are so many conflicting reports about this. For instance, there are stories of how Red Army aircraft tried flying over the Reichstag to drop flags onto the building during the assault, whilst other sources report Soviet troops flying a flag out of a second floor window before it was then replanted on the roof later. What we do know is that fighting was still raging throughout the building well into the next morning, meaning that the Reichstag was far from pacified on the 30th of April. So it's unlikely anyone was able to plant a flag that day. Meanwhile, in the Führer bunker, shortly after noon, Hitler had started giving his final farewells to Goebbels, Bormann, and other members of his inner circle. Afterwards, he had lunch with his secretaries and personal dietitian. And shortly after 3 p.m, just as the Soviets were making the last preparations for their storming of the Reichstag, Adolf Hitler and Eva Hitler committed suicide in their sitting room. As per Hitler's instructions, the bodies were wrapped in a cloth and hurriedly taken upstairs to the Reich Chancellery garden, where they were quickly placed into a ditch, had petrol poured over them, and were set alight. Goebbels, Bormann, Krebs, and Hitler's chief adjutant, General Burgdorf, paid their final respects as the bodies burned. And once the flames had died down, what remained of Adolf and Eva were unceremoniously buried in a shell hole nearby. And that was that. The man responsible for bringing so much death and destruction to the world had met his end. And crucially, he had gone out by his hand, rather than at the hands of the Russians. Goebbels, in his new role as Chancellor, immediately opened surrender negotiations with the Russians. Bormann, meanwhile, decided to play another pointless political game, as he waited a few hours before sending Grand Admiral Dönitz a rather cryptic message. The message informed Dönitz that Hitler had appointed him to be his successor as head of state of the Third Reich, and that, in his new role, he was therefore authorized to take any measures the situation demands. The attentive ones out there in the audience will have picked up on the fact that Bormann left out the part where Hitler was, dead. To prove that this message was as clear as mud, Dönitz replied back in the early hours of the next day, with a message declaring his continuing and unwavering loyalty to Hitler. Oh, that's very useful now, Dönitz, thanks. Meanwhile, Krebs sent a message to General Weidling, who was busy making preparations for the breakout of the remaining garrison troops. And in the message, he informed him that permission for a breakout had been rescinded, and that he was to report at once to the Führer bunker. It took Weidling almost an hour to make it to the bunker due to the intensity of the fighting. And when he arrived, he was informed that Hitler had committed suicide, though Hitler's death was a big secret which Weidling was expected to keep. More importantly, Goebbels, as the new Reich Chancellor, informed Weidling that he had ordered contact to be established with the opposing Russian commanders in order to request safe passage for General Krebs to Soviet High Command. Once there, Krebs was to inform the Russians that Hitler had committed suicide, request an armistice, and then convey the message that the Third Reich was keen to immediately begin surrender negotiations with the Soviet Union. Weidling, understandably, was shocked by what he heard, and he thought to himself, "This is the end." Hitler's suicide is widely seen as being a bookend in the story of the Third Reich, and in many ways the death of the Führer perfectly summed up the fact that Nazi Germany had lost the war. However, that didn't mean the war would simply end the moment Hitler shot himself. Of course not. And in fact, the next 48 hours would be dominated by a bizarre diplomatic dance between the Germans and the Soviets in Berlin, as the new German leadership tried desperately to salvage a shred of honor amidst the complete collapse of the Nazi regime. All the Soviets cared about was receiving an unconditional surrender, and until they got one, the fighting in Berlin was to continue. Thank you for listening to the Europe at War podcast. If you're enjoying the show and want to stay up to date with all the latest episodes, don't forget to hit that follow or subscribe button. You can also help spread the word by leaving a rating or review on your favorite podcast platform. It really makes a difference and helps more people discover the show. And if you like what I do, why not consider becoming a Patreon supporter? In doing so, you will help keep the podcast marching forward. To find out all the details, please check out patreon.com/Europe at War. Thank you.